Chronicle of a Demise by Tennessee Williams. The many letters which have come into my hands from provincial members of the Order requesting some information about our saint's disappearance were left unanswered till now, because among us at the center some hope still persisted that we would be given a sign on which we could premise some faith in her transfiguration. That hope having lately been formally abandoned, there seems no longer to be any valid excuse for further withholding the facts set down hereunder. Our saint's admired exaltation during the swift last summer of her life, the 2 months spent on a cot on the roof of her cousin's East Side apartment building, was due not so much to any profound resurgence of faith in the Order as it was to the coffee drunk black without sugar, 2 or 3 times a day on an empty stomach. This coffee was all that the saint was willing to take from her cousin's table, and this she only accepted because we had been assured that if she did not accept it, it would be poured down the kitchen drain. The coffee was brought up to her not by the cousin himself, but by his orphan nephew, a child of 10 who was crippled and had some difficulty in climbing the stairs. On one occasion, the crippled child stumbled as he was approaching the saint with the pot of coffee, and a small amount of the coffee was splashed on her forehead. Now I was a witness to this slight misadventure, from which a rumor derived that the cousin's party had plotted to blind the saint. And while I am not an apologist for the cousin's behavior, I consider it my duty to report that a bit of loose tar paper on the roof, and not any plot downstairs, was responsible for the spilling of the coffee. The coffee was always brought up in the battered aluminum percolator that it was prepared in. The saint drank it from the percolator's spout, supporting herself on the elbows and looking out over the rooftops toward the East River, where she believed she would see the ship returning if it returned that summer. Under the cot was the scarlet heart-shaped box, once a container of Valentine's Day candies, in which were kept the articles of our faith. There appears no longer to be the slightest reason for holding back knowledge of how these things were collected. They were collected at random, in subway stations, and under the seats of trains, and gutters and alleys of many different towns, even by theft from persons whose homes she visited while the saint and myself were engaged in the membership drive. The charge which was made by some members of the left that the saint had begun to entertain doubts in regard to the articles is based on the entrance for August 1st in my journal. Upon that date, I had come to see her about the nomination of something that Agatha Doyle had placed in the possible box. This article was a piece of purple tinfoil which Agatha had picked up on Father Duffy's square. The saint looked it over but seemed to be unimpressed. I put the article back in the possible box. There was an interval of silence between us. And then the saint, who had raised herself on her elbows to look at the article Agatha had proposed, dropped suddenly back on her pillow and made the remark which those on the left construed as a disavowal. The articles in the box are destructible matter. That was all that she said. And it was said in a tone of no particular bitterness. It was somewhat unexpected, however, and I turned my face to the chimney in order to hide a momentary embarrassment while I transcribed the statement. The saint reached out and took hold of my tablet and pencil, and under the statement which I had just copied down, she wrote this highly significant addition. Matter is not what matters. And then she smilingly handed back the journal. I am sure you must see how far this actually was from a disavowal. The fact it was so misconstrued is evidence of the extremes to which the left was now carried in its determined effort to create a schism. By the close of July, the apostasy of cousin had grown too apparent for anyone to ignore. His dwindling attendance had now fallen off to the point that he ceased to appear at the Saturday rearrangements. Once, when a thunderstorm came from across the East River and made it advisable to take the collection downstairs, as the iron cot itself appeared to be in some danger of blowing away, the cousin refused to have the articles placed in his apartment. He claimed that his wife had developed a strong nervous dread of the things in the box, and that having them near her was likely to give her convulsions. The child with his leg in a brace delivered this message to us just as we were grouping about the box, preparatory to taking it downstairs. The saint, supported on one side by Agatha Doyle and by myself on the other, was having a manifestation and seemed not to catch a single word of the message. The child, as he read it aloud from the typewritten sheet of coarse manila paper, was rubbing a bruise on his forearm, a purplish discoloration, which led me to feel that the mission had been forced upon him. The attitude of the child is not important, but extremists of both parties have attributed to him a sort of precocious Machiavellianism, which fairness compels me to say was not borne out by anything I observed. He was innocent of design as a carrier pigeon. The child had already slipped back down the stairs before any of us who were attending the saint had time to absorb the import of the message. Agatha Doyle let go of the saint's right arm. The saint bounded up like a paper kite on a string. I shouted, "Agatha, what on earth are you doing?" It took 3 others besides myself and Miss Doyle to haul the saint back down. Of course, by this time the manifestation had passed. She seemed to be stunned, and we thought it best not to mention our reason for not removing the box from the roof. The storm had already passed over. At least, the worst of it had. Agatha Doyle was securing the saint to the cot with the belt of her dress, when not 5 minutes after he gave us the message, the child reappeared and was bearing the percolator. I noted he had a second bruise on his arm. The same arm, but lower, close to the wrist, and his eyes were inflamed as if the child had been weeping. He thrust the coffee pot toward the recumbent saint. Agatha took it first. She gave me a startled glance and passed it to me. I looked in the percolator and found it was empty. It had been thoroughly scoured. Not even an odor of coffee remained about it. To all of us on the right, and even to most of the so-called liberal group, it was plainly evident that things could not go on as they had been going, and that some sort of culmination was close at hand. It came in the last week of August. A record number of 7 new articles had been placed in the possible box the night before, and a meeting had been called to consider the sanctification of a wad of spearmint gum that Hannibal Weems had picked up on the steps of an escalator in Gimbel's department store the previous Tuesday. The rites of induction had been already concluded. The saint, supported on one hand by Doster Parker and on the other by me, was delivering such an enraptured incantation that she appeared unaware of her cousin's tardy arrival on the roof. He had come out on the roof in ceremonial dress, complete with the one and rather shocking exception of worn canvas sneakers, which had an offensive odor. He leaned against the chimney, looking on sullenly as the sanctified articles were installed in the box. The 7 new articles had been placed at the bottom. This was, of course, an arbitrary disposal. Under more usual circumstances, degrees of sanctity would have been determined, and the articles put in strictly graded positions. This would have called for a 24-hour session, which at the time not even the indefatigable Mr. Parker was in a condition to undertake without recess. All but 4 or 5 of us had gone downstairs to partake of a buffet supper, prepared and served by girls of the junior committee. A few of the party in power remained on the roof, near the saint, who had fallen silent and seemed to be exhausted. The party of the opposition was all withdrawn from the roof except for the cousin. The cousin began to mutter. He circled about the chimney several times in widening orbits, which bore him continually closer to the cot. Darkening in the east. On the other side of the river, the great power plant was already lighted up for the summer evening. The cousin at last spoke out, addressing the saint. "I know what has happened," he said. "The expedition has returned, and you are stalling for time because it came back empty-handed." At this remark, the Mrs. Doyle and Lamantia scrambled away from the cot like a pair of frightened hens, and rushed pell-mell down the stairs. The saint and her cousin and I were all that remained on the roof. To my astonishment, then the saint replied, "Yes, the expedition returned last week empty-handed." "What are your plans?" asked the cousin. The saint replied that the ship had already sailed on another voyage. "Secretly?" asked the cousin. "Of course," said the saint. The cousin appeared to receive this answer calmly. Then all at once his arm shot out and grabbed hold of the box. "It will have to end now," he shouted. He flung the box with all his force from the roof. There was a brief confusion. The saint drew open her gown and opened her chest. Her heart divided as leaves of thin tissue paper. The leaves blew out. They blew in the face of the cousin, who sputtered and coughed as though he had sniffed red pepper. I made an attempt to hold the leaves from dispersion. I caught a few of them and thrust the few I had caught back into the cleft of her bosom. But it was too late. The clock spring was making a little rasping noise. Then this stopped too. Her 2 clenched hands came open. Her eyeballs, hard and beautifully blue as marble, sprung straight out on their glittering coiled attachments. "Let her go," said the cousin. We both released the limbs we were holding down. A fine, cool spray was dashed back into our faces as all her tissues divided and lifted away. In half a minute, she had gone altogether. The cousin said nothing, but stared at the empty cot. His wife could now be heard at the foot of the stairs calling him down to supper. He went without speaking, and as there was obviously nothing more to be done, I followed him down from the roof, picked up my hat, and silently left the building. This is all that I have to report of the matter. Now, as for instructions, I really have none to give you. The center has now disbanded and ceased to exist as an organizational unit. The future course of individual members is now a matter of individual choice. As for myself, I am intending to travel, but where I shall go and the purpose of my going are matters I feel at liberty not to divulge. Published 1948. Rubio y Morena by Tennessee Williams. The writer Kamrowski had many acquaintances, especially now that his name had begun to acquire some public luster. And he also had a few friends which had kept over the years the way that you keep a few books you have read several times but you are not willing to part with. He was essentially a lonely man, not self-sufficient but living as though he were. He had never been able to believe that anybody sincerely cared much about him, and perhaps no one did. When women treated him tenderly, which sometimes happened in spite of his reserve, he suspected them of trying to pull the wool over his eyes. He was not at ease with them. It even embarrassed him to sit across from a woman at a restaurant table. He could not return her look across the table nor keep his mind on the bright things she was saying. If she happened to wear an ornament at her throat or on the lapel of her jacket, he would keep his eyes on this pin and stare at it so intently that finally she would interrupt her talk to ask him why he found it so fascinating, or might even unfasten it from her dress and hand it across the table for closer inspection. When going to bed with a woman, desire would often desert his body as soon as he put off his clothes and exposed his nakedness to her. He felt her eyes on him, knowing, involving, and the desire ran out of him like water, leaving him motionless as a dead body on the bed beside her, impervious to her caresses and burning with shame, repulsing her almost roughly if she persisted in trying to waken his passion. But when she had given up trying, when she had finally turned away from his unresponsive body and fallen asleep, then he would turn slowly, warm with desire, not shame, and begin to approach the woman until, with a moan of longing, greater than even his fear of her had been, he would rouse her from sleep with the brutal haste of a bull in loveless coupling. It was not the kind of love-making that women respond to with much understanding. There is no tenderness in it, neither before nor after the act was completed, with a frigid embarrassment first and the satiety afterwards, both making him rough and coarse and nearly speechless. He thought of himself as being no good with women, and for that reason his relations with them had been infrequent and fleeting. It was a kind of psychic impotence of which he was bitterly ashamed. He felt it could not be explained, so he never tried to explain it. And so he was lonely and unsatisfied outside of his work. He was uniformly kind to everybody just because he found it easier to be that way. But he forgot nearly all of his social engagements, or if he happened to remember one while he was working, he would sigh, not very deeply, and go on working without even stopping to call on the phone and say, "Excuse me, I'm working." His attachment to his work was really somewhat absurd, for he was not an especially good writer. In fact, he was nearly as awkward in his writing as he had been in his relations with women. He wrote the way that he had always made love, with a feeling of apprehension, rushing through it blindly and feverishly, as if he were fearful of being unable to complete the act. You may be wondering why you are presented with these unpleasantly clinical details in advance of the story. It is in order to make more understandable the relationship which the story deals with, a rather singular relationship between the writer Kamrowski and a Mexican girl, Amada, which began in the Mexican border town of Laredo one summer during the war when Kamrowski was returning from a trip through the Mexican interior. Because of his suspiciously foreign name and appearance, and a nervous habit of speech that easily gave the impression of an accent, Kamrowski had been detained at the border by customs and immigration officials. They had confiscated his papers for an examination by experts in code, and Kamrowski had been forced to remain in Laredo while this examination was in progress. He had taken a room at the Texas Star Hotel. It was intensely hot the night he spent there. He lay on the huge, sagging deck of the bed and smoked cigarettes. Because it was such a hot night, he lay there naked with the windows open and the door open too, hoping to make a draft of air on his body. The room was quite dark except for his cigarette, and the corridor of the hotel was almost lightless. About 3 a.m., a figure appeared in the doorway. It was so tall that he took it to be a man. He said nothing but went on smoking, and the figure in the doorway appeared to be staring at him. He had heard things about the deportment of guests at the Texas Star Hotel, and so he was not surprised when the door pushed farther open, and the figure came in and advanced to the edge of the bed. It was only when the head inclined over him and the heavy black hair came tumbling over his bare flesh that he realized the figure to be a woman's. "No," he said. But the caller paid no attention, and after a while Kamrowski was reconciled to it. Then pleased, and, at last, delighted. The meeting had been so successful that in the morning Kamrowski had kept her with him. He asked her no questions. She asked him none. They simply went off together, and seemingly it did not matter where they went. For a few months, Kamrowski and the Mexican girl named Amada had traveled around the southern states in a rattletrap car held together by spit and a prayer. And most of that time, the girl sat mutely beside him while he thought his own thoughts. What her thoughts were, he had not the least idea and not much concern. He only saw her turn her head once, and that was when they were passing down the main street of a little town in Louisiana. He turned to see what she looked at. A gaudily dressed Negro girl stood on a street corner in a cluster of roughly dressed white men. Amada smiled faintly and nodded. "Puta," she said. Only that. But the faint smile of recognition remained on her face for quite a while after the corner had slipped out of sight. She did not often smile, and that was what occurrence had stuck in his mind. Companionship was not a familiar or easy thing for Kamrowski, not even the companionship of men. The girl was the first he had lived with at all continuously, and to his content he found it impossible to forget her presence, except as some almost abstract comfort like that of warmth or of sleep. Sometimes he would feel a little astonished, a little incredulous over this sudden alliance of theirs, this accidental coming together of their two so different lives. Sometimes he wondered just why he had taken her with him, and he could not explain this thing to himself, and yet he did not regret it. He had not realized at first what a curious-looking person she was, not until other people had noticed it for him. Sometimes, when they stopped at a filling station or entered a restaurant at night, he would notice the way strangers looked at her with a sort of amused surprise. And then he would look at her too, and he too would be amused and surprised at the strangeness of her appearance. She was tall and narrow-shouldered, and most of the flesh of her body was centered about the hips, which were as large as the rump of a horse. Her hands were large as a man's, but not capable. Their movements were too nervous, and her feet clopped awkwardly around. She was forever stumbling, or getting caught on something because of her ungainly size and motions. Once, the sleeve of her jacket got caught in the slammed car door, and instead of quietly opening the door and disengaging the caught sleeve, she began to utter short, whimpering cries, and to tug at the caught sleeve till the material gave way and a piece of sleeve tore loose. Afterwards, he noticed that her whole body was shaking as if she had just passed through some nervous ordeal. And throughout their supper at the hotel cafe, she would keep lifting up the torn sleeve and frowning at it with a mystified expression as if she did not understand how it got that way. Then glancing at him with her head slightly tilted in a look of inquiry, as if to ask him if he understood what had happened to the torn sleeve. After the supper, when they had gone upstairs, she took out a pair of scissors and cut the sleeve neatly across to give it an edge. He pointed out to her that this made a disparity between the lengths of the two sleeves. "Ha ha," said the girl. She held the jacket up to the light. She saw the disparity herself and began to laugh at it. Finally, she threw the jacket into the wastepaper basket, and she lay down on the bed with a copy of a movie magazine. She thumbed through it rapidly till she came to a picture of a young male star on a beach. She stopped at that page. She drew the magazine close to her eyes and stared at it with her large mouth hanging open for half an hour, while Kamrowski lay on the bed beside her, only comfortably, warmly half-conscious of her until, before sleep, as peacefully as he would sleep, he turned to embrace her. Kamrowski had grown to love her. Unfortunately, he was even less articulate in speaking about such things than he would have been in trying to write about them. He could not make the girl understand the tenderness he felt toward her. He was not a man who could even say, "I love you." The words would not come off his tongue, not even in the intimacies of the night. He could only speak with his body and his hands. With her childlike mind, the girl must have found him altogether baffling. She could not have been able to believe that he loved her, but she must have been equally unable to fathom his reason for staying with her if he did not. Kamrowski would never know how she explained these things to herself, or if she tried to explain them, or if she was really as mindless as she had seemed. Not looking for reasons for things, but only accepting that which happens to be as simply being. No. He would never know how. The dark figure in the doorway of the hotel, even mistaken at first for that of a man, did not come into the light. It remained in shadow. Morena. She called him Rubio sometimes when she touched him. Rubio meant blonde one. Sometimes he would answer Morena, which means dark. Morena. That's all she was. Something dark of skin, dark of hair, dark of eyes. But mystery can be loved as well as knowledge, and there could be little doubt that Komrowski loved her. Nevertheless, a change became evident after they had lived together for less than a year, which may not seem a long time, but was actually a relationship of unprecedented duration in the life of Komrowski. This change seemed to have several reasons, but perhaps the real one was none of those apparent. For one thing, the presence of women had ceased to disturb him so greatly. That nervous block described in the beginning was now so thoroughly dissolved by virtue of the effortless association with Amada that his libido had now begun to ask for an extended field of play. The mind of a woman no longer emasculated him. The simple half-Indian girl had restored his male dominance. In his heart, he knew this, and was grateful. But one does not always return a gift with an outward show of devour. He paid her back very badly. That winter season, which they spent in a southern city, he began to go out in society for the first time in his life, for he had lately become what is called a name and received a good deal of attention. It was possible now to ignore the ornament at the throat of the woman and return, at least now and again, the look of her eyes without too much mortification. It was also possible to make amatory advances before she had gone to sleep. That winter, Komrowski began to form other attachments of more than a night's duration, one in particular with a young woman who was also a writer and a member of the urban intelligentsia. She had also one defect. She wore contact lenses which she used to remove before going to bed, and Komrowski had to ask her not to put them on the table beside the bed, but in the little drawer of the table. But this was an unimportant item in the affair which went along smoothly. He began to make love to this girl, Ida, more regularly than he made love to Amada. Now, when Amada would turn to him on the bed, he would often avert himself from her and pretend to be sleeping. He would hear her beginning to cry beside him. Her hand would move inquiringly down his body, and once he seized her hand and slammed it roughly away from him. And she got out of bed. He got up too and went into the kitchen and sat there with a pitcher of ice water. He heard her packing her things as she had done often before. Her trunk was a military locker. The bottom of it was filled with random keepsakes, such as restaurant menus, pictures of actors torn from movie magazines, postcards from all the places they had visited in their travels. Sometimes, while she was packing, she would stalk into the kitchen, holding up some article, such as a towel that she had filched from a hotel bathroom. "Is this yours or mine?" she would ask. He would shrug. She would make a terrible face at him and return to the bedroom to continue her packing. He knew that she would unpack everything in the morning. In the morning, she would restore the souvenir menus and postcards to their places, about the mirror and the mantel, because without him there was no place for her to go and no one to go with. He did not want to feel sorry for her. He was enjoying himself too much to allow a shadow of contrition to weigh upon him too heavily. And so he would think to himself, for self-exoneration during such scenes, "She was only a whore in a third-class hotel where I found her. Why isn't she happy? Well, I don't give a damn." And yet he was very glad, when he had finished drinking the pitcher of ice water, to find that she was no longer packing, but had gone back to bed. Then he would make love to her more tenderly than he had for many weeks past. It was a morning after an incident such as this that Kamrowski first discovered that the girl had begun to steal from him. Thereafter, whenever he put on his clothes in the morning, he would find his pockets lighter of money than they had been before. At first, she took only silver, but as the earnings of his novel increased, she began to increase the amounts of her thefts, taking $1 bills, then 5 and $10 bills. Finally, Kamrowski had to accuse her of it. She wailed miserably, but she did not deny it. For about a week, the practice was suspended. Then it started again, first with the silver, increasing again to bills of larger denomination. He tried to thwart her by taking the money out of his pockets and hiding it somewhere about the apartment. But when he did this, she would awaken him in the night by her slow and systematic search for it. "What are you looking for?" he would ask the girl. "I am looking for matches," she'd tell him. So at last he humored her in it. He only cashed small checks and let her steal what she wanted. It remained a mystery to him what she did with the money. She apparently bought nothing with it, and yet it did not seem to linger in her possession. What did she want with it? She had everything that she needed or seemed to wish. Perhaps it was simply her way of paying him back for the infidelities which he was now practicing all the time. It was later that winter of their residence in the large southern city that the ill health of Amata became apparent. She did not speak of her suffering, but she would sometimes get up in the night and light a holy candle in a transparent red glass cup. She would crouch beside it mumbling Spanish prayers with a hand pressed to her side, where some of pain was located. It made her furious when he got up or questioned her about it. She behaved as if she were suffering from some disgraceful secret. "Mind your own business," she would snarl back at him if he asked, "What is it?" Hours later, she would waken him again, crawling back into bed with an exhausted sigh, which told him that the attack of pain had subsided. Then, moved by pity, he would turn to her slowly and press her to him as gently as possible so that his pressure wouldn't renew the pain. She would not go to a doctor. She said she had been to a doctor a long time ago, and that he had told her she had a disease of the kidneys, the same as her father had had, and that there was nothing to do but try to forget it. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I'm going to forget it." She made an elaborate effort to conceal the attacks as they became more frequent and more severe, thinking perhaps that her illness would disgust him, and he might forsake her completely. She would steal out of bed so cautiously that it would take her 5 or 10 minutes to disengage herself from the covers and creep to the chair in the corner. And if she lit the prayer candle, she would crouch over it with cupped hands to conceal the flame. It was evident to Kamrowski that the infection in her body, whatever it was now passing from a chronic into an acute stage. He would have been more concerned if he had not just then started to work on another novel. The girl Amata began to exist for him on the other side of a center which was his writing. Everything outside of that existed in a penumbra as shadowy forms on the further side of the flame. Days and events were uncertain. The ringing of the doorbell and the telephone was ignored. Eating became irregular. He slept with his clothes on, sometimes in the chair where he worked. His hair grew long as a hermit's. He grew a beard and a mustache. A lunatic brightness appeared in his eyes while his ordinarily smooth face acquired hollows and promontories and his hands shook. He had fits of coughing and palpitations of the heart, which sometimes made him think he was dying, and greatly speeded up his already furious tempo of composition. Afterwards, he could not remember clearly how things had been between himself and Amata during this feverish time. He ceased to make love to her. He ceased that altogether, and he was only dimly aware of her presence in the apartment. He gave her commands as if she were a servant, and she obeyed them quickly and wordlessly with an air of fright. "Give me coffee," he would suddenly yell at her. "Play that record again," he would say, with a jerk of his thumb at the Victrola. But he was not conscious of her except as a creature to carry out such commissions. During this interval, she had quit stealing his money. Most of the day, she would sit at the opposite end of the wide front room in which he was working. As long as she stayed at that end of the room, her presence did not distract him from his work. But if she entered unbidden his half of the room, or if she asked him some question, he would yell at her furiously, or even hurl a book at her. She became very quiet. When she went to the kitchen or bathroom, she would move one foot at a time, slowly and stealthily, gazing back at him to make sure he had no objection. Her face had changed, too, in the same way that his had changed. The long equine face had become even bonier than before and dreadfully sallow, and the eyes now glittered as if they looked into a room where a great light was. She moved about with an odd stateliness, which must have come from the suffering caused by the movement. One hand was now always pressed to the side that hurt her, and she moved with exaggerated uprightness in defiance of the temptation to ease her discomfort by crouching. These details of her appearance he could not have noticed at the time, not consciously, and yet they came to him vividly in recollection. It was only afterwards, too, that he troubled himself to wonder how she might have interpreted this disastrous change in their way of living together. She must have thought that all affectionate feeling for her was gone, and that he was now enduring her company out of pity only. She stopped stealing his money at night. For a month, she sat in the corner and watched him with the dumb, wanting look of an animal in pain. Occasionally, she would dare to cross the room. When he seemed to be resting from his labor, she would come to his side and run her fingers inquiringly down his body to see if he desired her. And finding out that he didn't, she would retire again, speechlessly to her side of the room. And all at once, she left him. He had spent a night out with his new blonde mistress and returned to find that Amata had packed her locker trunk and removed it from the apartment, this time in grim earnest. He made no attempt to find her. He believed that she would necessarily return of her own accord, for he could not imagine her being able to do otherwise. But she did not return to him as the days passed, nor did any word of her reach him. He was not certain how he felt about this. He thought for a while that he might even be somewhat relieved by the resulting simplification of his life, and the absence of that faint odor of disease which had lately hung sadly over the bed they had slept in. There was still always the book, sometimes loosening its grip now that the first draft was finished, but still making him insensible as a paranoiac to everyday life. During the intervals, when the work dropped off, when there was discouragement or a stop for reflection, Kamrowski would take to the streets and follow strange women. He glutted his appetite with a succession of women and continually widened the latitude of his experience, till all at once he was filled with disgust at himself and the circus trapeze of longing on which he had kicked himself senselessly back and forth since the flight of the girl he had lived with. He didn't want any more of that now or ever. And so one night, about 5 months after their separation, the image of Amata stalked with a sound of trumpets through the midnight walls of his apartment. She stood like some apparition of flame at the foot of his bed, all luminous from within as an X-ray picture. He saw the tall white bones of her standing there, and he sat bolt upright in the sweat-dampened covers and gave a loud cry. Then he fell back on his face to weep uncontrollably till the coming of morning. When daylight was coming, even before the windows had turned really white, he rose to pack his valise and arrange for the trip to Laredo, to find the lost girl and bring her back into the empty room in his heart. He assumed without thinking that Laredo was where she would be, because it was where he had found her. He was not wrong about that. She had returned to Laredo 5 months ago, but not to the Texas Star where he had found her. The manager of the hotel pretended to have no knowledge of the girl, but the Mexican porter told him that he would find her in the home of her family on the outskirts of town, in a house without number on a street without name, at the bottom of a steep hill on which stood an ice plant. When Kamrowski arrived at the door of the gray wooden house to which these directions took him, a building no more than a shack which leaned exhaustedly on the edge of a steep and irregular road of gray dust, all of the female family came to the door and talked excitedly among themselves, brushing him avidly up and down with their eyes, half smiling and half snarling at him like a pack of wild dogs. They seemed to be arguing almost hysterically among themselves as to whether or not this stranger should be admitted. He was so sick with longing to see the lost girl that he could not bring out the little Spanish he knew. All he could say was, "Amata," more and more loudly. And then all at once, from some recess of the building, a loud, hoarse voice was lifted like the crow of a cock. It had a ring of anger, but the word called out was the affectionate name she used to call him, Rubio, which meant blonde. He swept past the women, brushing them aside with both arms, and made for the direction from which the fierce call had come. He fairly hurled himself against the warped door and broke into a room which was all dark except for a vigil light and a red glass cup. He looked that way where the light in the glass cup was. There he saw her. She was lying upon a pallet arranged upon the bare floor. It was impossible to judge her appearance in the windowless room, a sort of storage closet, with that one candle burning, especially since he had just come in from the glare of a desert sunset. He made out, gradually, that she was wearing a man's undershirt, and he noticed how big her hands and her elbows were now that the arms were so emaciated. And her head seemed almost as big as the head of a horse, and the familiar coarse hair was hanging like a horse's mane about her scrawny neck and shoulders. His first emotion was fury, as well as pity. "What does this mean? What are you doing in here?" he cried out fiercely. "Mind your own business," she yelled back at him, exactly as if they had never been separated. Then he swallowed his rage at her family, still going on with her high-pitched argument beyond the door he had slammed shut. He crouched on his haunches beside the pallet and took hold of her hand. She tugged away from his grasp, but not quite strongly enough to break it. She seemed to be trying to seem more alive than she was. She did not let herself entirely back down on the pallet, although he could see it was an effort for her to remain propped up on her elbow. And she did not allow her voice to drop, but kept it at the same loud and harsh pitch. She did not remove her eyes from his face, which she seemed to be straining to examine. But she did not return his look directly. She seemed to be staring at his nose, or his mouth. There was a great bewilderment in her look, a wonder at his being there, at his coming to see her. She asked him several times, "What are you doing here in Laredo?" And his answer, "I came here to see you," did not seem to satisfy her. At last he leaned over and touched her shoulder and said, "You ought to lie back." She glared at him fiercely. "I'm all right," she said. Her dark eyes were now immense. All of the light that came from the ruby glass cup was absorbed in those eyes, and magnified into a beam that shot into his heart and deprived that moonlight organ of all its shadows, exposing in brutal relief the barrenness of it the way that the moon's landscape, with the sun full on it, turns into a hard and flat disk whose light is borrowed. He could not endure it. He sprang from beside the pallet. He dug in his pocket and pulled out a handful of bills. "Take these," he whispered hoarsely. He tried to stuff them into her hands. "I don't want your money," she answered. Then after a slight pause, she muttered, "Give it to them." She jerked her head toward the door beyond which the family were now preparing noisily for supper. He felt defeated altogether. He sighed and looked down at his hands. Her own hand lifted, then, and reached falteringly toward his head. "Rubio," she whispered, the word for blonde. Tiredly, one of her hands dropped down his body to see if he desired her. And discovering that he did not, she smiled at him sadly and let her eyes fall shut. She seemed to be falling asleep. So then he leaned over and kissed her gently at the edge of her large mouth. "Morena," he whispered, which was the word for the dark one. Instantly, the long, bony arms flung about him an embrace which took his breath. She pressed their faces painfully together, her Indian cheekbones bruising his softer flesh. Scalding tears and the pressure of those gaunt arms broke, finally all the way through the encrusted shell of his ego, which had never before been broken all the way through. And he was released. He was let out of the small but apparently rather light and comfortable room of his known self into a space that lacked the comfort of limits. He entered a space of bewildering dark and immensity, and yet not dark, of which light is really the darker side of the sphere. He was not at home in it. It gave him unbearable fright, and so he crawled back. He crawled back out of the gaunt embrace of the girl. "I will come back in the morning," he said to the girl as he rose from beside the pallet and crawled back into the small room he was secure in. When he returned in the morning, the atmosphere of his reception was different. There was an air of excitement in the place that he could not fathom, and all of the women seemed to have on their best clothes. He thought perhaps it was because of the money that he had left in the sick room. He started to cross to that room, but the old woman plucked his sleeve and pointed toward another. She led him into the parlor of the house, and he was astonished to find that they had moved the girl there. Because he did not understand their speech, he could not realize at first that she had died in the night. This he did not realize until he had picked up her hand, nearly as dark as a Negro's, and found it cool and stiffened. They had dressed her in white, a nightgown of clean white linen that shone with starch. And when he released the hand, the oldest woman advanced and placed it carefully back in its former position on the flat bosom. He noticed also that the odor of sickness was gone, or possibly lost in the odor of burning wax, for a great many candles had been brought into the room and set in ruby glass cups on the window ledges. The blinds had been lowered against the meridian glare of the flat desert country, but the glare filtered through pinpoint perforations in the old fabric, so that each blind was like a square of green sky with stars shining in it. The mourners assembled there were mostly neighbors' children, the smallest ones naked, the larger dressed in gray rags. One little girl was holding a homemade doll, roughly cut out of wood and painted into a grotesque semblance of human infancy. Coarse black hair had been attached to the head. It seemed somehow like an effigy of the dead girl. Unable to look upon the actual face and its now intolerable mystery, Kamrowski stole to the side of the half-naked child and gently and timidly thrust his hand toward the doll. He touched the coarse black hair of the doll with a finger. The child complained faintly and hugged the doll closer to her. Kamrowski began to tremble. He felt that his hand must keep in touch with the doll. He must not let the child move away with her precious possession. And so, with one hand, he stroked the head of the child, while, with the other hand's finger, he kept in touch with the familiar black hair. But still the child edged away, withdrawing from his caress and regarding him with huge, distrustful brown eyes. Meanwhile, a whispered consultation seemed to be going on among the women. It grew louder with excitement, and finally the grandmother, with an abrupt decision, separated herself from the group and approached Kamrowski and cried out to him in English, "Where is Amada's money? Where is her money?" He stared at the old woman stupidly. "What money?" She made a fierce spitting noise as she thrust toward him a handful of yellow papers. He looked down at them. They seemed to be telegraph forms. Yes, they were all money orders, sent from the city in which he had lived with Amada. The sums were those she had stolen at night from his pockets. Komrowski looked wildly about for a way to escape. The women were closing about him like a wolf pack, now all jabbering at once. He made for the outer door. Beside the door, the little girl with the doll appeared to him dimly. Impulsively, he reached out and snatched the doll from the child as he ran past her into the dusty brilliance of the road. He ran as fast as he could up the steep and irregular dirt road with the wailing child running behind him, feeling only a need of hanging on to the child's grotesque plaything till he was alone somewhere and able to cry. Published 1948.